What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast. A podcast dedicated to helping you achieve your life's dreams and setting aside the self-limitations. If you guys haven't listened to this podcast before, I'm your host, Brandon Davis. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the topic of, are you looking down on your hike? Guys, I'm super excited to jump into this episode. There's going to be a lot of wisdom shared, some personal experiences, and I think a lot of experiences that we have all shared inside of our lives. Before we jump full force into it, though, if you haven't listened to last week's episode with Logan Richardson, please feel free to check that one out beforehand. We're going to be tying a couple of the principles from last week's episode into this week's episode. And if you guys have not, just make sure to go give that a listen. With all that being said, let's jump into today's episode. Now, in today's episode, I want to be focusing on this concept of, are you looking down on a hike? But before we jump full swing into that, I want to give a little bit of a kind of picture you can paint inside of your head. I think a lot of us recognize that the most fulfilling moments inside of our life, the greatest adventures, the biggest accomplishments, they all stem from something very difficult that has come to pass in our lives. Whether that's getting a new job where you had to go through the grilling process of interviewing and kind of outranking all your other opponents who were applying for the job. Maybe it's a new relationship where it's very difficult because you're trying to learn the ins and outs of your partner. You're trying to understand what makes them tick, how you guys can get along, how you guys can continue growing in love. That can be a very difficult yet rewarding thing. Or maybe it's a new fitness journey, right? You're trying to lose a little bit of weight, maybe get a little stronger. That is something that is incredibly difficult, yet the results are so rewarding when you actually accomplish them. Some of these biggest instances inside of our life, I would argue the biggest instances inside of our life, come from these difficult moments, these things that kind of build up. If we're on a crevice of a hill, it just builds up, until you finally reach that peak or that climax. The difficult situations brought us to those amazing moments. And now, on a very much literal sense, on those amazing moments, those difficult parts where you are climbing up and you hit that climax of the peak, I want to discuss a little bit about my personal life on when I go hiking. I have been an avid hiker and backpacker since I was probably the age of 9. And this stems, I had an awesome dad who put me into Boy Scouts when I was younger. I had even better, when it comes to outdoorsy things, better scout leaders who pushed me to go out in nature and actually experience and adventure what God put on this beautiful earth. And I can remember from some of my younger days, I'd go camping and I would be looking up at the most beautiful stars. I would go bouldering and we'd just be climbing over these massive rocks. And then that night at camp, we'd make all this massive fire and cook hot dogs or campfire stew and sing your campfire songs. When I was younger, I absolutely loved camping. And then as I got a little bit older, it progressed to not just the small little bouldering moments, these cool car camping experiences, but I wanted a little bit more. I got big into hiking, where I'd go out. Sometimes it'd be a single day where I'd go 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 miles in a day and just go hiking. Some of these hikes, they're the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I've hiked Mount Baldy in California, Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in the continental U.S. I've hiked Hatcher's Pass out in Alaska, Delta Lake out in the Tetons. I've done these beautiful hikes inside of my life. Some of them are obviously a little bit more strenuous than others. But for today's purpose, I want to talk about Mount Whitney. Like I mentioned a minute ago, Mount Whitney is the highest mountain in the continental U.S. And I remember when I first started preparing for Mount Whitney, it was with my scout troop. I was 14 at the time. And my scout troop, we kind of ranged from the level of outdoorsiness and age and kind of physical capabilities that a lot of scouts had at the time. I remember I was towards the younger group of kids that were still able to go on this trip. I think the youngest we took was 13 years old at the time. And I remember I was looking up to some of these older guys, and it was just such an inspiration to me. I saw some of my little 14-year-old heads and role models. I was a freshman in high school at the time, or going into my freshman year. This was the summer right beforehand. And I saw these older boys who I had looked up to in my scout troop for years. And we were preparing together. We were preparing both physically and then also mentally, and on a more very literal point, preparing our bags so we'd have everything we needed for this journey. But to get in full swing, it took months of preparation to prepare for Mount Whitney, between trying to get acclimated to the climate, the altitude, making sure our bags were in good condition. What kind of food would we have in our group? Who would carry the poles for the tent? Who would carry the tent? Who would carry the tarps? Who would carry the water purification, right? There's all these minute details that come into preparing yourself for a long backpacking journey. And this was a 6-day journey, guys. Over the course of the entire time, we covered over 90 miles while we were doing the 6-day journey. And, at some points you're going through rolling hills. On some points you're going straight up. Some points you're going down into the valleys. But it was a strenuous time. So this preparation beforehand, little 14-year-old Brandon, he was getting excited. He thought, man, this is going to be the greatest moment of my life. All these older boys are surrounding me. I got my scout leaders here who I want to impress. I'm going to go see and do something that is super hard, especially for a kid my age. And then when that moment finally came, I remember we started hiking. But then the first couple miles, I was so tired already. And don't get me wrong, all the preparation did help, but it's a little bit more intense from when you've been preparing just by going on simple couple mile hikes versus when you're actually in the trenches, when you're accomplishing your goal, right? You do all the preparation beforehand, but once you actually dive into the nitty gritty, it can be very difficult. And so on this Mount Whitney journey, when I first started, it was killing me. I still remember my shoulders were super sore. I had like a 30-pound backpack on for all my camping gear. You got your bear canisters, your food, your tents, all this stuff. I had this big old bag on, so my shoulders are hurting. I had brand new hiking shoes that I had barely worn in, so I'm getting blisters all over my feet. And it was a tough little moment for a 14-year-old. And despite these little challenges, I was still super excited. I saw the older guys in the troop. I saw the couple buddies I had my age, and we kept pushing each other along. We'd sing along the trail, we'd go do our thing, and we made a good time of it. And after the course of 4 or 5 days, we made it to the very bottom, little valley right below the summit of Mount Whitney. So there's this massive lake. It's called Guitar Lake. It's a massive lake right underneath the base of Mount Whitney. And as we were camping there that night, a group of us were deciding if we wanted to get up really early so we could catch the sunrise. And so my uncle, who was there at the time, and one of my cousins, we said, you know what, we're going to go for it. And so bright and early, we went to bed early that night. You get to see all the beautiful stars and whatnot. But bright and early the next morning, probably around 3:30, 4, if I remember correctly, all of us start hiking up the highest point of Mount Whitney. And I remember when I started doing this climax, I felt horrible. I was no longer worrying about my sore feet from the new shoes or my shoulders that had been hurting from my backpack. I had a whole different scene in front of me. I got altitude sickness. And you got to keep in mind, although this isn't the tallest mountain in the world, it's the tallest in the continental US. All of our training had tried to prepare us for this altitude, but frankly, there was nothing around where I was living at the time that fully prepared me for the altitude. So I remember I'm at this peak. I'm probably a good 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from the summit. I have gone this entire journey and I feel horrible. All I want to do is kind of throw in the towel. And I remember I told my uncle and cousin, I said, go on ahead. I'm going to wait here for a little bit and try and catch my breath. And while I was doing that, I kind of realized something. The entire time when I was embarking on this journey, from the very beginning, from day one on mile 1 to up until this point, we're probably about 80-ish miles in, because we still had to climb down and exit out. So we're probably about 80 miles in. I had been looking at the ground nearly the entire time. So there my uncle and cousin went. I'm sitting on this rock and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, it's the one moment out of this entire journey where, because remember, I'm only a couple miles away from the summit at this point. I'm kind of overlooking this entire valley. We could see way far in the distance. I could see a lot of cars from down in the actual valley where they were driving through. I could see just miles and miles of landscape, other big roaring mountains around me. I could see the tree line down below. I could see some squirrels kind of hanging out around me, looking if I give them a couple of my trail mix peanuts or whatnot. And I sat there thinking, even though I felt horrible, I was like, this is like the first time in this entire journey, this entire backpacking experience, that I've actually looked up and thought how beautiful it is. Me and my buddies, my troop, we were getting around, we were getting it done, but I don't think I really appreciated how beautiful the entire scenery was. Yeah, I mean, at night you look up at the stars and you think those were really amazing. You dive into the creek partway through the hike in the day and you cool off and you think that was wonderful. But this was the one moment on the entire hike where I was like, holy cow, I've been surrounded by this beautiful nature the entire time and I didn't even take a second to appreciate it. I was by myself and I was able to kind of collect my thoughts. And I realized the entire time I was staring at the ground as I was hiking. Just making sure I wasn't tripping over the rocks that were put on the trail. Making sure I wasn't tripping over any extra logs or any twigs in the trail that might trip me up. And with all due respect to myself, I mean, obviously you don't want to sprain your ankle, but on a more metaphorical point, I was ignoring all the beauty around me because I was simply focused on the one foot in front of the other mindset, where I was staring right at the ground. And sometimes if I was in the back of the pack, I was staring at somebody else's feet, just trudging along, thinking about how miserable my shoulders were, my head hurt, how much my feet hurt. That's all I could picture because all I was doing was staring at the ground. I wasn't enjoying my journey at all. I wasn't focusing on the beauty around me. It wasn't until that moment when I actually got sick and had to take a second to breathe that I recognized how beautiful it was. And right after I hit that, I don't know if it was probably just a placebo inside of my head, but all of a sudden I felt a little bit better. I drank some water, I ate a PB&J, and I finished those last 2 miles and I summited. And at the very top, I remember, I don't know if this is the best thing to do while you're hiking, but I finally had some cell service. I remember calling my family. I FaceTimed them. It wasn't the greatest connection, but I FaceTimed my mom and dad and I said, guys, look how beautiful this is. I'm at the very top of Mount Whitney. I accomplished something as a young 14-year-old that many other 14-year-olds could not do. I did something that I was proud of, and I had finally picked my feet up and made it those last 2 miles. I was no longer staring at the trail just with my eyes pointed straight towards the trail. I was looking over the valley. I was seeing the beauty that the journey had actually produced for me. So my question for you, in your life's journey, are you keeping your head down, staring at the trail the entire time, eyes pointed straight down, only focusing on the pain inside your shoulders, the ache in your feet, the headache you have from the long, exhausting day in the sun? Or are you taking an extra moment to look up and appreciate the beauty that is surrounding your trial? Some of the toughest moments, as I've already clued into inside this episode, some of the toughest moments we have inside of our life come from these difficult journeys. But if all we do is sit back and stare at the ground as we hike, no way on earth are we actually going to enjoy them. We need to sit around and enjoy the moment, see the beauty around us, just like I did when I was feeling altitude sick. I looked around, I saw the lake, I saw the animals, I saw the trees, I saw the hills. I started to enjoy one of the most physically demanding journeys I had ever been on. No longer was I worried about my pain or my sickness. I was focused on the beauty around me. So in your life's journey, are you doing the same? Or are you keeping your eyes straight on the trail where you don't deviate and you can't actually enjoy the journey, but more focused solely on the pain? Because if that is you, my challenge that I want to leave for all of you today who are struggling on that path right now, this metaphorical trailhead, my challenge for you is to look up and enjoy the journey a little bit more fully. There's going to be the hardships. You're still going to feel the pain, the aches. You're going to get sick every once in a while. But I promise you, if you stop and enjoy where you're at and recognize the accomplishment you've already done from the very beginning of the trail, this metaphorical trail, to the very point you're at now, you're going to have a giant smile on your face and say, wow, I really just accomplished that. So guys, that's my challenge I want to leave for you today on the Get Over Yourself podcast. Pick your eyes up off the trail and enjoy the beauty that's surrounding those hard destinations you're trying to reach to inside of the goals of your life. Try it out. Let me know. As always, down in the description of today's episode is going to be a link to my email and social media. If you guys ever have any questions, make sure to reach out to me. Also, if you think somebody you know would personally benefit from hearing today's words spoken on the podcast, make sure to send it to them. It's how I continue to grow the show. Guys, thank you so much. And at the end of the day, just remember, it'll all be okay. Just take a step back and pick your eyes up off the trailhead and enjoy the beauty in the challenges.